All right. Welcome back to History 102 at JMU for the Adult Degree Program, Summer 2025. I am Joe Wilson. We are back for Lecture 5. It's in the second week of our course. I'm recording this on the 27th. And Lecture 5 is on Ming and Qing China as well as Tokugawa Japan. We're going to turn towards Asia for the first time in our class. And as I like to do at the beginning of the lectures, just sort of sum up what we've done so far. We began the course just talking about how we're doing the most recent 500 years. And the first 300 years we're going to talk about in the first half of the course. And we're doing it thematically. The first couple of lectures, we talked about the Americas and sub-Saharan Africa prior to sustained and direct contact with Western Europeans. So we had a basis of what those civilizations and cultures were like prior to the Columbian Exchange. Then we talked in some detail about the Columbian Exchange, how it took place, the ramifications of the exchange, some of the long term effects, and the maritime empires that rose, why they arose, their motivations for reaching out, how it occurred, and how there were successive maritime empires of Western Europeans reaching into the Indian Ocean trade system. Then we focused in on Europe, particularly Central Europe. Well, I'm skipping over the gunpowder empires of Islam that we also looked at that helped trigger the Renaissance and Reformation. We talked about the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, and how they come to power. And how this is an additional motivation for Europeans to find a more direct route to circumvent the Muslims as intermediaries of trade towards the Indian Ocean. Then we get to Renaissance and Reformation. We talk about how the northern Italian states rise to prominence and how the rich families support a cultural and financial rebirth, how this spreads to the north, printing press, and the publication of the Bible in vulgar, meaning the common languages of the people. This spreads a Reformation, which leads to wars of religion that ravage Central Europe for more than 100 years. Now let's turn east. What's been going on in Asia? Well, all of that's been going on in the Atlantic world and in the Middle East and in South Asia and in Africa as the Atlantic slave trade's going on. And the first assignment you had to read the letter from the King of the Congo to the King of Portugal. Now let's look east. Let's talk about Asia. We'll start here in the Ming Dynasty. And it's difficult to start talking about Chinese history right here in the middle, not knowing what you might know about Chinese history coming into the course, particularly in the context of Chinese culture. and what you may or may not know about Confucianism. When we say things like Confucianism or Buddhism or Taoism, I'm not sure what you might know coming into this, but Confucianism is a philosophy that is very influential on Chinese politics because it is a philosophy that is not just encompassing the person and the family life, but it indicates a great deal of direct um, advice on how to govern the people. So, Confucian um, schools and Confucian examinations and earning Confucian um, documents, proving your knowledge of Confucian principles have been a long-standing tradition in China since the classical period. And those Chinese dynasties that have embraced Confucianism have been very successful. And Confucianism as a philosophy has spread far beyond the borders of China into Southeast Asia and into Japan as a traditional life way. And what do I mean by that? It stresses filial piety, meaning that the father is the head of the family and he is to be respected and to be obeyed because he is the father, not because of anything he has done to earn your respect, but because he holds that position. And that position is to be obeyed and to be respected. It is not the holder of the position, it is the position itself. And Confucius argued that if you act in such a manner in all of your relationships in society, then society is reliable. It is not corrupt or disastrous. And he said all of your relationships in society are like that. He said, just as the father is the head of the family, so the king is the head of the kingdom. So just as, let's say, you are the child in the family, your father is superior to you. The father is superior to the mother. Your older brother is superior to you. If you have a friend, if he is older than you, then you must defer to the older friend. It is a very conservative and traditional viewpoint on all social interactions, but it is not meant to be exploitative at all. In fact, it is centered on the idea of developing the characteristic of the benevolent gentleman. When Confucius was asked if he could sum up all of his philosophy in one idea, he said, at the moment of personal gain, at the moment of profit, one must consider what is the moral action. So, at its core, it is it is focused on ethics, but it is very much traditional hierarchical in its nature and very much the humble estate for females in this. Why am I telling you all of this? Because I think if you don't know any of that coming into the understanding of Ming China, you don't know what we're talking about. Because the Ming will overthrow the Mongols. And I've talked about the Mongols several times now. Because coming out of the medieval period, it is the retreat of the Mongol Empire back into Mongolia as they are experiencing centrifugalism, the decline generationally of the virtues of their rulers. So they're pulling out of Russia, they're pulling out of Persia, they're pulling out of China. And the story that you'll see is that Hong Wu, the son of a peasant who rose up through the ranks of the military, will overthrow the last of these Mongol emperors. But you must take that with a grain of salt, because if you read Chinese history, this is a very common story that you will hear about emperors rising, that they are the son of a peasant and that they rose through the ranks of the army. Chinese history is very difficult to put together oftentimes because the incoming dynasty likes to burn all of the history that preceded them so that it looks like they can rewrite the history so that it appears that they have always been in power. They're not the only people to do this. The ancient Egyptians did this. This is why the ancient Egyptian history is so hard to put together cohesively, because often they destroyed the records of previous dynasties so to legitimize their rule. Well, under the Ming, they used the military to expand China further into the desert west and into modern Vietnam and across Manchuria into modern Russia. They're going to expand the government. They're going to reinstitute the Confucian exam system. They're going to set up public education. They're going to expand the Grand Canal. And if you've never learned about that, that is a system of canals, a system of artificial waterways that the Chinese have ever worked on since the classical period, connecting the Yellow and Yangtze rivers through all their tributaries so that they have a massive network of waterways to connect all their villages and tribal regions to all their cities so that they have a level of infrastructure to move food and all sorts of goods throughout eastern China. So this is going to help the Ming have a period of economic greatness. A young emperor named Yongle is going to come to power. They will begin construction on the imperial city in modern Beijing in around 1406. And this will become what we call the Forbidden City and will be the home for China's emperors for about 500 years. So, in the image on the left, you see from above an aerial photo of the Forbidden City. On the right, you can see a diagram. This is the personal home of the Chinese emperors. It's a city within a city. You can sort of think of it as the Vatican within Rome, but look at the grander scale of it. If you look at all of the buildings, look at everything that you see, consider the arts and crafts that it required to build all of this. China is the equal of or superior of any culture on earth in this period in terms of just about anything: science, medicine, technology. And they are exporting goods many times reluctantly into the Indian Ocean system. They feel that they have everything in the world that they need, and there is nothing made anywhere else on this earth that they require. Well, the young emperor, you can call him Yongle. Sometimes it's all run together and it appears as Yongle. He will be assisted by one of his eunuchs named Zhonghua. I know it looks like Zhang He, but it is pronounced Zhonghua. Eunuchs serve the emperors. rulers. If you read through Chinese history, you will see there are eunuchs everywhere. These are men who have been castrated to serve in the courts of the great rulers. Some of these men are from families that produce men that willingly are castrated so that they may serve in these high positions. But Zhuanghua is much like the Janissary slave soldiers that we learned about. He was captured in Western China when the army was, well, capturing social undesirables, capturing Muslims. You see, under Mongols, the Mongols were religiously tolerant. They allowed any religion. And this opened China to Christianity and Islam and all sorts of things that China had never been open to before. So in Western China, his family and others had become Muslims. Well, this was not okay under the Ming. So he was captured as a small boy and he was brought to the court and castrated and put into the court schools, much like the Janissaries had done with the Ottomans had done with the Janissaries. Well, he dedicated himself to learning, became adept at languages and philosophy, and he became a good friend to Yong Li. And he convinced Yong Li to build a fleet, something the Chinese had not done before. And he said, build a fleet, and I, having studied the sciences of navigation, will take this fleet out onto the seas of the world and express the greatness of China in a way it's never been done before. Yong Li approves this, and they build shipyards on the coasts at the terminals of rivers. And they build sort of a factory system where they're numbering the various pieces of the boats so that different workshops can build the different parts and have them assembled in different places. So over those years, they built a massive fleet and put it to sea. Some 62 massive ships, some as long as 600 feet, and hundreds of support ships. So they go out to sea into the Indian Ocean. A 600-foot ship compared to the caravel, the Santa Maria of Christopher Columbus, that was 85 feet long. These were massive vessels in comparison to what the Europeans were able to produce. They sailed around the Indian Ocean. Well, what was their point? They would sail around Southeast Asia, Indonesia, to India. They went all the way to the Swahili coast of Africa. And they went by what was known as the tribute system. Zhuanghua would arrive on your coast, and let's say you were the king of a tribe in Indonesia, the ruler of a city state somewhere in Guinea or in Vietnam. And he landed and he presented himself diplomatically with gifts. He said, I am Zhuanghua. I represent the great Emperor Yongli of the most powerful entity in the world, glorious China. Offer us tribute and be our friend. Well, what would you do? It's pretty obvious you would offer them tribute and be their friend. Well, let's say Zhuanghua landed, and this person obviously gives them tribute to be China's friend. But let's say they also say, but Zhuanghua, I have a problem. You see, I have a rival here, and he says he is the ruler. But you clearly see I am the rightful ruler. Would you use some of your soldiers and weapons to help me get rid of this terrible, evil interloper? What would you do? It seems that Zhuanghua obliged and would land some of his troops, as you see here on the right, what they may have been like, and helps, perhaps, depending on your point of view, politically stabilize some of these regions as he's traveling through and collecting this tribute and diplomatically opening relations all over the Indian Ocean system. He'll end up bringing back giraffes from Africa, which the Chinese will take for a mythical beast from their tales. But after Zhuanghua dies, what happens to the treasure fleet? When he and Yongli are dead, the ministers in the government and the next emperor dismantle the fleet, and subsequent records of the travels of the fleet are destroyed. And it is only very recently that we can talk confidently about this being a real event. That map I showed you at the end of the Sub Saharan Africa lecture, showing you the ceramic and coin finds on the Swahili coast, things like that, helping verify these things. Why would they do this? This is before Columbus and the Columbian Exchange. If they had continued, could you imagine Chinese ships sailing up the Thames before Columbus arrives in Hispaniola? And what the ramifications of that might be. They believed that this was an unworthy venture, that it cost more than it was bringing China, that the outside world didn't have things that China needed. And they were very Confuciusly conservative. If there were things in the outside world that could come to China, perhaps that would mean change. And that's one thing Confucianism does not want, is change. It desires tradition. So, in 1424, after Yongli's death, that's it. So that in 1514, Portuguese will arrive off China's coast instead of the other way around. The Ming are going to give way to the Qing, meaning the Manchu. So the Manchu, who had been run over by the Ming early on, are going to rise up against the Ming. Let me point out here that none of these people call themselves Chinese. China is what we call China because that's what the Romans called China. because it was the Qin dynasty during the Roman Empire, from parts of. So that's why we ended up calling it China. All right. So we're going by these dynasties to say who's ruling over this big geography. Okay. So the Manchu dynasty is going to rule over this geography we're calling China because they're going to rise up in rebellion against the rulers in Beijing. Manchuria is a plain north of the Korean Peninsula. And these are steppe peoples, much like the Mongols or the Ottomans, meaning they are horse-born warriors. And they are going to, via warfare, hide on the centers of power like Beijing. And ethnically, if you were to ask someone in China what they were ethnically, they would say they were Han. That's what most of them would say. So these Manchurians, are going to now suppress and, what's the right word? They're going to exploit and suppress the majority Han Chinese population, ruling as a tiny percentage as a military dictatorship over them. So the Qing will be able to conquer what is essentially all of modern China as well as Mongolia and rule it as steppe warrior overlords. Much like the Mongols before them, they're going to live outside of Han Chinese society and rule them from above. As this says, they are only 2% of the population. They're going to rule over the rest of the Han Chinese. One of the big things that the Qing or Manchu dynasty is going to do, unlike the Ming, who were resistant to exporting commercial goods, the Manchu are not. To earn favor with the mass majority of peasants, they will have very light taxes and they're going to build a lot of infrastructure. But to raise money, they're going to open China to European traders in ways that it had not been open before. So Europeans will be allowed into Chinese ports. Further, because of this opening commercially of China to Europeans desperate for Chinese goods, that demand is going to increase the supply of exported goods to the point that those goods are going to decline in quality dramatically. So if you've ever heard anyone praising a Ming vase or something else from the Ming period, it is because the Ming period articles were not exported broadly and were still of very high quality, while items from the Qing period are not. They become mass produced in Chinese workshops for the export market. That begins under the Qing. You're going to see Christianity grow in China, especially in the peasantry, to the point that the Qing will outlaw it moving into the mid 1850s as missionaries continue to pour into China because it has opened itself commercially. Internally, the Manchu are going to force the Han to change the way they wear their hair. I have another slide I'll show you. They will change the way they wear their hair and force them to wear their hair the way the Manchu do, to have a public humiliation of the Han, so that they must subjugate themselves publicly by wearing their hair in a different manner. They'll ban intermarriage between the Manchu and the Han. And you'll see Europeans coming in with ideas like communism and things like that. With all of these concessions to Europeans and to the Japanese, you see a bit of turmoil coming in. So, with this slide, you see prior to the Qing dynasty, men either wore their hair up in a bun or wore it loose around their shoulders. Under the Qing, it now needed to be braided down their back and shaved halfway up their head. And what you're going to see in the early 20th century is a Western style haircut, which means we are now liberated from the past and we want to move into the future. So, yes, in their art, what you're going to see is imitative art. You're not seeing the more original works that you would have seen in the Ming. You're going to see the more printing in different colors on the porcelain that is more intended for Western audiences. And what you're going to see is over time, peasants will become increasingly angered at how that 2% is going to become enormously wealthy as they have nothing. So we're going to see internal rebellions, the White Lotus Rebellion in the late 1700s. And what we have here is the Qing getting really wealthy off Western silver. The Spanish are going to bankrupt themselves by purchasing Chinese goods with the silver that they're literally minting themselves from the New World. This image here on the left is a coin I came across. If you look at it, it says Carolus III de Gracia 1789, which means Charles III, by the grace of God, minted in 1789. And I can tell you that that was probably minted in modern day Mexico and was shipped across the Pacific from Acapulco into the Philippines and ultimately into China to pay off Spain's debts. And the image on the right you see is almost the same coin. It's just for Charles IV in 1792. Now, the difference between the coins you see is the one on the right has Chinese symbols all over it. That means that it was in China, and those are proof marks, people testing it to make sure that it's silver. Well, what is the significance of all that? Because China was receiving so much silver from the New World, the government was becoming so wealthy and reliant on silver, they said that everyone has to pay their taxes in silver. The peasants can't even afford to buy the silver to pay their taxes with. And that's what's going to break out in rebellion. That the government doesn't even understand that we're so poor, we can't buy any silver. So, how are we supposed to pay any taxes? So, that's where we're going to leave China for now. When we get back, believe me, there's going to be a civil war of seismic proportions, but we'll leave it there for now. And we'll talk about Japan. So, what's Japan like? It's just off the coast of Asia, there, this archipelago. But that distance is sufficient for a unique culture to rise. The image you see here on the right, this map, you can tell is a region of tribes, region of tribal peoples. And all of the feudal tribal lords, known as the daimyo, fought incessantly with one another because that is the nature of tribal societies. If I was teaching of you about the Germanic or Celtic people, I would be telling you the same thing. They fought incessantly among one another for resources, over borders, over animals, over water rights. Incessantly. It was endemic. Well, that's also true in Japan. They fought constantly among one another. It's not that they were warlike, they were simply tribal. Everyone that goes through a stage of tribalism is like that. So in 1543, what we see in this closed tribal society that tends to self isolate, doesn't like outsiders very much, we see who? Portuguese Jesuit missionaries. And what did we learn about the Jesuits? Ignatius of Loyola. We're going to focus on reforming Catholicism through education and spreading the word of Christ. And what did they arrive with? Guns. So they arrived with guns in Jesus. Well, guess which one they really liked? Guns. So many of these tribal warlords said, hey, these guns might give us the edge in all this fighting we do with each other. And these clocks and eyeglasses and other neat things you guys got. And oh, tobacco, that's neat. We'll smoke that. That's neat. But these guns, yeah. And Christianity, sure, whatever. Well, the problem with the guns is this is a samurai culture. They're a special class of citizen, and what we're going to learn is the social hierarchy here. They're the ones who are the warriors. These guns don't go to the samurai. The big base of society are peasant farmers. The guns go to the peasant farmers. That's going to disrupt the social order in Japan. If a peasant farmer with a half hour of training, can now kill what is essentially, for Western audiences, a noble knight. That's a problem. So these guns have now disrupted things. And you can see the dates on the screen: late 1500s, early 600s, 1600s. So Oda Nobunaga is going to capture Kyoto, and he's going to win control of central Japan. And he is going to eliminate a sect of militant Buddhist monks. And the Jesuits are going to overplay their hand. They will go around destroying Shinto shrines. Now, Shintoism is an indigenous to Japan belief, and it's popular. So their desecration of these shrines is going to allow Oda Nobunaga to officially suppress Christianity. Unfortunately, Nobunaga is betrayed and assassinated, and Toyotomi Hideyoshi is going to step into his place, one of his loyal generals, and eliminate all the rest of his rivals. And he will unify Japan. I hope you like all the art that I'm showing you, because Japanese history is not my strong point. But I think that this art does a lovely job of illustrating the time and place. I think most of you in the course are Westerners, but many of you are international students. After unification, he's going to try to centralize power by leveling castles, by taking those weapons away from farmers, by taking weapons away from monasteries, and with the introduction of outside trade, he's going to try to reaffirm the social classes by forbidding the samurai from engaging in trade, from engaging in farming, and from engaging in crafting. Meaning, if you are a samurai, you have a noble position. It is better that you would spend your idle time in poetry and in music and some other um, field than the base pursuit of profit. So Hideyoshi is going to continue the tradition of persecuting missionaries. The fact that they had brought guns, the fact that they had disrupted Shintoism, he is going to have them crucified publicly, put on display, so any other ships that come by can see them. Do not come here with this. He dreams of expanding his conquest beyond just a unification of Japan, but those dreams of going into Korea aren't fulfilled until industrialization. These were massive battles, and it required, well, you can see here in this illustration, we call this a feudal period because of the political arrangements, but you can also see militarily how, with all the heraldry involved, this is still a rather feudal arrangement. Tokugawa Ieyasu is going to herald in his own period of a golden age. We'll call it the Tokugawa shogunate, because he is going to succeed Hideyoshi. And he's going to have a couple of innovations that are going to make Japan strong and loyal to the emperor. He's going to become the shogun, and he's going to move the base of power to Edo Bay, which is modern Tokyo. And this begins nearly 3 centuries of the Tokugawa shogunate. What is it that he does that is going to make this so stable, so peaceful? So the shogun is going to be the political ruler. And this is when the emperor becomes more of the religious Shinto figurehead. The capital is now Tokyo. Here's a map to show you all the regions now under control of the shogun. See, they now have some roads, major port systems. How is he going to keep all of these areas who have been warring forever loyal to one man in Tokyo? The emperor as the head, the shogun, and all the regional lords, the daimyo, the samurai who serve them, the peasants and the artisans. Why are the merchants at the bottom of society? This is a very Confucian conception of society. You've seen these social pyramids your whole life. Why would merchants be below peasants? That's sort of backwards to Western thinking. In Western thinking, you normally see farmers on the bottom and merchants above them. In the Confucian conception, the profit motive is so suspect that merchants are seen as lower because they're seen as not having made anything for their money. They didn't actually produce anything. They didn't grow food. They didn't make anything. You understand? So this is why they don't want the samurai engaging in these things that they believe are lower than them. They believe they have a special and privileged place. So they don't want them engaging in these money-making activities. So I keep asking you, how does he keep all of those regional warlords loyal? This is the alternate attendance system. Alternate attendance system. The shogun is always in Edo. The daimyo must spend half their time in Edo and half their time out in their own holdings and their own lands. But the daimyo's families must remain in Edo all the time. This means that the daimyo must be away from his family for half the year, and that family is in Edo with the shogun. This is something called being a diplomatic hostage. The implication is to ensure the loyalty of all the regional warlords of the daimyo. The implication is if those regional warlords were to betray the shogun, raise an army, and wish to march on Edo, the first to die would be his own family, that the shogun would have them killed. And it would be unfeasible for any daimyo to be able to afford enough samurai to protect his family in Edo and form an army to march against the emperor or against the shogun. This is how he's able to accomplish this. And it works, this sort of diplomatic hostage taking. And this illustration I enjoy very much because it shows the sort of lifestyle that they wish to promote, that at its most genteel, that these samurai would spend their days drinking tea and playing musical instruments and smoking tobacco and maybe enjoying any new luxuries from the new world and enjoying their time with these ladies and enjoying a beautiful view of the harbor with these new boats that are coming and going and just enjoying this wonderful life isolated in Japan. You know, seems to be the world that they've created for themselves. By 1750, it's the most urbanized country in the world, meaning that their population is living most all in towns and cities. Edo is probably 1 million people by 1750. You see capitalism emerging. They are literate, they are educated, but we still see the issue with farmers, samurai, the strict social hierarchy. Well, if everyone is now moving into towns and cities and we see everyone needing money, how is everyone supposed to stay in these strict classes? Things are changing quickly and they're not changing with it. In the 1600s, they make an effort to try to slow things down. They expel all the Christian missionaries and they really, again, try to suppress the spread of Christianity. They're going to forbid Japanese from traveling abroad. And they're going to say only the Dutch may trade with us. They're the only ones we'll trust. And they will only be able to trade with us on this one island, this man made island in the harbor at Nagasaki. That's the only thing we'll do with the West. No more open trade, no more open Christianity. They can come to this island and we'll trade with them there, and only the Dutch. Here's some illustrations the Japanese have made of those Dutch. So in Edo, in Kyoto, in Osaka, we see big cities, even in the 1600s, big cities forming. So in this Tokugawa period, it's a real golden age of culture. Things like kabuki theater, dance halls, tea houses. Hope all of this art is representative and you can see all of this. I think all of us have had to write a haiku at one point or another. So you can see, and I know all of us have seen this painting or a derivation of this painting at one time or another, the Great Wave of Kanagawa. Yes, in Japanese fiction, I'm not a huge fan of it and I don't know a lot about it, but I know there is a great body of it. So if it is something that you're interested in, I do enjoy the art. And there we are. So when we come back to Asia, what we're going to come back to is Asia being truly opened up by Europeans. When we come back, we'll see how the United States opens up Japan and how China is laid open by Great Britain. And that's enough for today. And thank you all very much.